Hi, my name is Avi. I'm a graduate student and researcher in the Department of Bioengineering at UW, and I'm a member of UAW Local 4121. Welcome to this town hall for Seattle's Districts 4 and 7, and thank you for being here. Our local is proud to co-host this event. Our housing justice work group has been involved in the Tax Amazon movement from the beginning, and our members have participated in action conferences and signature gathering events for the Tax Amazon ballot initiative. Tonight's town hall gives us an opportunity to have a community discussion about this crucial legislation proposed by council members Kashama Sawant and Tammy Morales. If passed, this measure will tax Seattle's biggest businesses, including Amazon, to fund COVID relief, social housing, and the Green New Deal. If you have any questions, you may put the questions in the chat of whatever live stream you're using, and we will compile them and answer them at the end. Here's tonight's agenda. First, we will hear from Councilmember Kashama Sawant, who will explain some of the details of the legislation. Next, we will hear from a great panel of speakers who represent a diverse range of groups and organizations. After the panel discussion, we will hear from the council members. We're excited to have Councilmember Andrew Lewis here from District 7. Unfortunately, Councilmember Alex Peterson from District 4 declined our invitation. He also declined to send us his remarks. We also invited at-large council members Teresa Mosqueda and Lorena Gonzalez. Councilmember Mosqueda sent us her remarks to be read aloud tonight. Councilmember Gonzalez also cannot attend. After the speakers have concluded, we will open up for questions to the panelists and the council members Lewis and Sawant. To submit your questions, which you can start doing at any time, simply type your questions into the chat window of whatever platform you're using to live stream tonight's event. Now, I'd like to introduce Councilmember Kashama Sawant. She is a rank and file member of AFT Local 1789, a member of Socialist Alternative, and is the council member of Seattle District 3, which includes the Central District, Capitol Hill, Madison Valley, and East Lake. Please welcome Kashama Sawant.
Thank you so much, Avi. Thank you to all my labor sisters and brothers and siblings from UAW 4121 and other unions who have joined us for this phone call. And thank you especially to the rank and file and the elected leadership of UAW 4121 for organizing this important district town hall, because as you yourselves have said, it is important that elected representatives hear from ordinary people, from working class constituents in the districts, because our voices are not often heard as loud and clear as the well amplified voices of the very wealthy, the Chamber of Commerce, and big business spokespeople. And I thank everybody who's joined us in this town hall. I think in a few minutes we will have a count of how many have joined through the 3 live streams. And those of you who have joined us through one of the live streams, Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch, can we please also have you, as I'm speaking, message your friends and family and coworkers right now. If they don't know about this town hall, make sure they take this opportunity to listen, because they're going to hear from many constituents, and not just people who agree with us, also people who are not, who may not be familiar with this or have questions about this because they've heard that somehow this a tax on big business will be a job killer, that somehow it is not viable or not legal. None of this is true. These are all falsehoods, but it's important that we learn how to counter these falsehoods and really empower our movement. I just wanted to frame my remarks in the context of this pandemic that we are in, and starting with where we were before the pandemic. As UAW's own surveys have shown, even before the pandemic, the graduate student workers and the working class as a whole in Seattle has been facing a major crisis of housing affordability. And so many are really precariously positioned, paying 50%, 70%, 80% of their income in rent, which means that if you have one small financial disruption, a loss of a paycheck, or one rent increase, and you're back to couch surfing or having to double up with relatives or being pushed out of the city entirely, and The worst possible scenario, of course, is to have to experience a bout, or even worse, an extended bout of homelessness, which has happened to many of our neighbors. So we were already facing that crisis. The city council and the mayor's office has actually failed to address this crisis in a way that it needs to, which is not through rhetoric and words, but through action, through an expansion of social housing, which is a critical component of addressing the housing affordability crisis. But now on top of that, we have this pandemic, which has created a triple emergency for us: a public health crisis, where our very lives are at stake, not the lives of the rich. Actually, it is not a neutral thing. It is the working class that is primarily vulnerable to this crisis. But on top of the public health crisis, we already had the housing affordability crisis. And now we are seeing the dire predictions for the recession, and also what has already happened with tens of thousands of Seattleites having been laid off or having lost hours. Obviously having to stay home because that's the correct thing to do, that scientists recommended, but not having the income even to buy groceries at some point, let alone be able to pay their rent. And with this pandemic under capitalism, the working class nationally and globally, not just in our city, has been caught in a vice grip of a public health crisis, endangering our lives if we go back to work. But then on the other hand, the prospect of months of lost income and increased impoverishment. This is an inevitability unless we get organized and fight back. So that's why it is so critical that we share with the city council that this is actually a triple emergency, and that it's their historic duty. It's the city council's historic duty, and I speak as a city council member myself, to address this. And that's why I really appreciate Council Member Andrew Lewis from District 7 attending today to hear from constituents. And I appreciate the comments from Council Member Mosqueda that austerity budgeting is not an option. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Austerity budgeting is not an option. And also it is not an option to simply say that austerity budgeting is not an option. We need action from the council members. That's why the district town hall is important. And workers need to get organized to win a bailout for ourselves, not a bailout for the billionaire class. And I think at this moment, the questions are posed in a stark manner. There is no question somebody is going to pay for this recession, the jobs crisis, the housing crisis, the public health crisis. The question only is, who will pay for this crisis? Will it be the billionaire class that has not only profited in the past, but is profiteering throughout this pandemic? Or will it be working people who are always paying the cost of all the struggles under this system? So I think the Amazon tax is not some sort of icing on the cake. It is a necessary component of making sure that the cost of this crisis does not land on the shoulders of ordinary people. And for the city council, it is a question of austerity versus the courage to tax big business. Because given that we have a regressive tax system, the most regressive in the nation, and given massive joblessness, it is inevitable. Again, it's inevitable that budgets are going to plummet. So either we face austerity for working people by major cuts in social programs, or we augment the budget through progressive revenues by taxing big business. It's as simple as that. And then, of course, tied into all of this is the question of public sector job creation, which is the only thing that will be able to combat the joblessness of the recession. Just like we saw in the aftermath of the Great Depression, it was determined and militant labor organizing that led to the winning of the New Deal several years after the onset of the Great Depression, which created public works programs, public sector union jobs, and allowed for housing and infrastructure construction while creating good jobs. That's what the Amazon tax is about. We don't pretend that it's going to be enough. We need this kind of measure at the state level, and especially huge measures at the federal level. But it is important to start at the city level. And right now we have momentum in our movement for taxing Amazon and other big businesses to address this triple emergency. We know the city council central staff has done a lot of research for us, and just a few technical details. It's very clear the tax is only going to fall on the top 2% of the businesses. So it is as progressive as it can be. It is the most prosperous of businesses that will be paying. Small business will not be overburdened, who are already burdened with taxation. And this year, the proceeds, which is $200 million, as Councilmember Morales and I have envisioned, would provide emergency cash assistance for up to 100,000 working class households, the neediest households. And then starting next year, to invest in jobs to build up to 10,000 new affordable social homes and retrofitting existing homes to Green New Deal standards, and by raising $500 million every year. And the council's central staff has, as Councilmember Lewis knows, determined that the legislation would create or support 34,000 jobs over the next 10 years. And these are jobs that our community will desperately need. Tonight is an important opportunity for the community to speak out. And as Avi said, please put your questions in your comments, and the UAW members will be looking for the questions to be read out so that we can share with myself and Councilmember Lewis and the community at large. And we provide an avenue for the community to combat the lies coming from the Chamber of Commerce, from big business, the Seattle Times editorial board, unfortunately from Councilmember Peterson, from Mayor Durkin, who are all nakedly fighting against a basic measure of social justice, and either overtly or by implication putting forward an austerity budget proposal, which we absolutely reject. So tonight we're hopefully going to hear from a lot of people who are participating here, and just wanted to share a few voices we've already heard. A few weeks ago, as many of you know, my council office released a community petition for the tax Amazon legislation from Councilmember Morales and me. And overall, I just checked this afternoon, we have almost 7,000 people who've signed this petition. A lot of people from my district, District 3, have been signing, but also we got more than 1,800 signatures from D4 and D7, District 4 and District 7 combined, which is a remarkable number. Hundreds of those petition signers from 4 and 7 districts have also added their own story. So I just wanted to read quickly. Andrew from District 7 wrote, "I haven't eaten in 2 days. There is no work for service industry workers. I cannot pay my rent or phone bill. I don't qualify for food stamps, and my unemployment is about to run out. We need help today." Nico in District 7 wrote, "Everyone is going to sacrifice to take care of one another during this crisis. Big businesses can afford to give up some of their profit margins and the salaries and bonuses of their executives without putting their health and housing at risk. Poor and working class folks have little to no cushion to fall back on. This is an obvious choice. The whole point of living in societies is to help one another survive and thrive, not to amass wealth among a few individuals." Christina from District 4 wrote, "People are scared and feeling helpless right now. The city deciding to tax big business with this legislation would be showing good leadership and compassion for those most vulnerable when they most need it. Please do the right thing and pass funding for COVID-19 relief and the housing crisis." And last but not least, Laura from District 4 wrote, "Please do the sensible thing and tax Amazon so we can use the money to help our community members survive through this pandemic. Not doing so is unconscionable. Not doing anything to help our ever-growing homeless population stay safe equals sending them to their deaths. We should probably get rent control while we are at it as well, so fewer of our community members are pushed into such precarious situations. Please do the right, necessary thing." These and thousands of other personal stories, which we don't have time to share at this moment, are why our Amazon tax legislation is so urgently needed. And it is because of this tremendous community support that we have so much momentum. So I'll turn the mic back to my co-MC, Avi Matarasso, to introduce our community panelists. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Councilmember Sawant. Okay, so let's move on to our panel discussion. So first on our panel, we have Christoph Strauss, who is a graduate student in UW's College of Built Environments, a member of UAW 4121, and part of our climate justice work group. He is also a member of the DSA, Seattle, and National Green New Deal committees, and a District 4 voter.
There, I'll give myself a. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Great. Just wanted to check. Thank you for those opening remarks, Councilmember Sawant, and thank you for hosting this, and for UAW 4121 for hosting this. I agree 100%, of course, that there's no economic recovery without big business being taxed, especially in Seattle, the city with the nation's most regressive tax system. We need to fix our regressive tax system here in Seattle and in the state, and this big business tax is a step in the right direction. And though the city has implemented mandatory affordable housing, it won't create enough affordable homes, and the affordability threshold won't address minimum wage and gig workers who fall below the poverty line. I currently pay more than 30% of my income on rent, and I live in one of the cheaper studios in District 4, Alex Peterson's district. So therefore, I believe we need this legislation to intervene in the speculative Seattle real estate market and to fund an expansion of approximately 10,000 affordable, publicly controlled social homes or apartments in the next 10 years. So I want to frame my remarks a little bit as a way to envision the positive social, economic, and environmental benefits which would result from this big business tax for COVID relief, social housing, and Green New Deal. Notably, it could support the development of two outcomes of which some of my interest or some of my research has been focused. And that number one would be equitable transit-oriented development, which could foster land trusts and cooperatives. And the second would be that those cooperative homes be affordable multifamily apartments. So first, this business tax could support a new program for equitable transit-oriented development, land trusts, and cooperatives near light rail stations in our urban villages where all of our development is being focused per Seattle's comprehensive plan. Further, the city could begin to partner with Housing Development Consortium of Seattle King County and their over 180 plus member organizations who are mission driven to support the development of community development and affordable housing. And they could be focused on the development of a shared equity model, including things like community land trust or shared equity housing cooperatives. And housing or community land trusts and cooperatives are an emerging alternative form of land and home ownership that provides the benefits that traditional markets cannot, as we know from the disastrous housing inequality and historic inequities brought upon all of our cities through things like racial covenants and redlining. And such long-term housing affordability and the ability for these families would come from something like land trusts or cooperatives to build equity and community wealth. These community land trusts and cooperatives would be below market rate, often tied to inclusionary zoning and resident-owned communities of green or sustainable multifamily units or homes. Community land trusts are community-run, nonprofit landholding organizations that sell or rent the units atop the land they own, usually with the intent of keeping that housing affordable in perpetuity. So in effect, embedding in these communities rent control and property ownership. So a great example here in Seattle is the Africatown Community Land Trust, which is working on community ownership of land in the Central District, which is historically a Black community, which has been completely hauled out by displacement and development and gentrification. And they support economic and cultural thriving of people who are part of the African diaspora in the Seattle greater region. Another example is that they're working on is the Liberty Bank Building and Midtown Center, both of which are projects that foster equitable community wealth building while countering the historic displacement amid the rapid gentrification that's happening in their community. So a couple of really good examples there. Further, cooperatives and community land trusts and shared and limited equity housing cooperatives are organizations of residents and in multifamily buildings, which where each household would own a share of the building. These shares, could be sold at market rates or below market rates or kept in perpetuity as part of the limited equity cooperatives. And these cooperatives then recoup a percentage of the equity earned on transactions, or as the market changes and fluctuates, they could subsidize the next cooperative owner or shareholder. So despite their growing popularity in a number of states and in Europe, shared equity housing faces numerous financial and regulatory challenges. However, I see that this business tax is a historic opportunity to address that and to leverage this tragic situation for affordable housing that could create a new program to streamline and incentivize the process for mission-driven community developers by forming a city-county coalition for publicly owned housing and cooperatives. So second, these community-owned cooperative developments would be green multifamily homes. These buildings be LEED Gold, leadership in energy efficiency and design, or living buildings, certified buildings that generate more energy than they use or capture and treat all water on site, and are made using low carbon, healthy materials that don't off-gas toxins or create an unhealthy environment. And just for a little bit of background, the Living Building Challenge is a green building certification program here, created here by the International Living Future Institute in Seattle, that defines a very sustainable building program for development. And these buildings can create net zero carbon buildings. And here in Seattle, we also have the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is created a tool to look at embodied carbon of materials like concrete or steel and ways to make these buildings zero carbon. Further, the Living Building Challenge looks at a red list of materials for occupant health and air quality that are free from toxic chemicals or off-gassing, as I mentioned previously. And these buildings are designed for natural light, air quality, and for natural heating and cooling, which reduces their need for HVAC and heating costs and energy. And after these buildings are designed, then you close the energy gap using things like solar or other forms of off-site solar development and energy to make them net zero. And currently, Seattle has a living building pilot program for about 20 buildings in the Seattle area. Most of these are commercial buildings. However, I think it's time that we focus on a living building pilot program for affordable multifamily apartments. Ideally, a pilot program that would look at a cooperative land trust model for a living building affordable apartment complex. I think this become a model for not only our area, but the United States as a whole. Though these would likely have a higher upfront capital costs, they would pay for themselves in life cycle costs through energy and water efficiency over time, along with higher property values to the homeowners, to those involved in the cooperative. And these types of developments will only get cheaper over time. Finally, green buildings like this near light rail stations could be publicly owned, affordable, and sustainable multifamily apartments that localize community wealth building and cooperative property ownership in our urban centers, thereby maintaining economic equity and cultural diversity for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Next, we have Nyan Park, who is a graduate student and researcher in the UW Department of Chemistry. She is a member of UAW 4121, and she represents her department as a head steward. She is also part of our union's International Solidarity Working Group.
Hi, my name is Nyan Park. As Abby said, I'm a graduate student and a researcher in UW's Department of Chemistry, and I'm a member and head steward of UAW 4121. I'm also an international student and part of our International Scholars Work Group. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak as part of this panel. Our union represents over 6,000 academic workers at UW, including graduate and undergraduate student workers and postdoctoral researchers. Our work as teachers, tutors, graders, and researchers is central to fulfilling UW's teaching and research mission. All of the members of our union are on fixed term appointments. 70% of our members' jobs will end within the next 5 weeks. 98% of them will end within the next year. If any of them are not reappointed, which is very likely given the economic impacts we're experiencing because of COVID-19, they will suddenly be without income and health insurance. Further, many of us are not eligible for existing relief programs like unemployment insurance. The effects of COVID, including the problem of appointment security, among others, will be particularly hard for international scholars who make up 40% of our union's members. We're here on visas, which won't allow us to work anywhere else if we lose our jobs, which means we would be at risk of deportation. Even before COVID, we were dealing with the ever-evolving travel ban, but the COVID travel restrictions create a real risk to international student employees and postdocs at UW. The US has cut off travel from a number of countries, and some of our members are from those countries. Working on a J1 exchange or F1 student visa, we have to we have to leave the United States in order to renew these visas. And the members of our International Solidarity Work Group, therefore, have been reaching out to international members whose appointments are ending before June to identify and hopefully help with any issues that they are experiencing. And I am here to share 2 of those stories that we've encountered. In my department, there's an academic researcher who is here on a J1 exchange visa, and this person was unable to return home due to travel restrictions. This put them at risk of overstaying their visa and facing the possibility that they would be prohibited from re-entering the US in the future. And despite these severe potential consequences, they have so far been unable to get an appointment extension due to lack of funding from the supervisor. Another researcher in my department had to return home to India to renew his visa in February. He could not return to the US because of the travel restrictions that were placed, and he still has his appointment but can't do his work from overseas. So without immediate relief from the city, thousands of researchers and instructors like me will face a near future with no ability to pay rent, no health insurance, no job prospects, and in many cases will put us at risk of deportation simply because we cannot secure funding or travel. We urgently need support that ensures economic security for working people during this crisis, including international workers. This is vital, both for continuing our collective efforts to flatten the curve now, and also for protecting the most vulnerable among us when the pandemic is over. For these reasons, we urge the City Council to pass this legislation. Our members, along with all other workers in Seattle, need COVID relief, and we need to address Seattle's housing crisis.
Thank you so much, Nayan. Next, we have Amy Madden, who is a leader in the 43rd District Democrats and a District 4 voter. Amy?
Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Amy Madden. I'm a state committee member representing the 43rd Democrats. The 43rd includes city districts 3, 4, 6, and 7. And I want to say that the 43rd Democrats have been really strong about where we stand when it comes to funding for housing and calling on big business to pay their fair share. We've passed resolutions in support of increasing social housing, passed support for the previous head tax, support for the Seattle Green New Deal, and at our upcoming meeting, we'll be considering a resolution in opposition to budget cuts and in support of taxing the rich. and we'll be discussing how we can be of further support for the Sawant-Morales legislation. We're a district that believes in equity, fairness, and centering the needs of our most vulnerable community members. And we support leaders willing to push for policy that does this. Now, on a personal note, I'm a resident of District 4, which is Alex Peterson's district. And as a low-income queer person with disabilities, I want to say that many in my communities were already struggling with housing before the COVID-19 crisis. Councilmember Sawant is absolutely right when she says that we have people in our community paying 70, 80% of their income for rent. Too many of us are hanging on to our housing by a thread. And the council member has talked in the past about how Seattle is becoming a playground for the rich. So many of us are witnessing that this is what is happening, and the rest of us are getting pushed out of our city. I live in the U District, where buildings like mine are getting torn down and luxury apartment towers are going up. As an environmental activist, I support increased density, but none of these new units are even close to affordable for me and my current neighbors. All of the lower income people in my neighborhood who are getting pushed out are going to have to commute increasing distances to get to work, which means more carbon in the atmosphere. And in a sustainable society, people need to be able to live where they work. And that can't happen without housing that is truly affordable. And that's going to require funding. So I support, and I know that my district supports the strongest legislation possible being passed. I really encourage folks who want to get involved with the 43rd's efforts to support this legislation. Feel free to reach out to us at 43rddemocrats.org. Thank you for the time tonight.
Thank you so much, Amy. Up next, we have Dr. Zoe Sandsted, who is a resident of family medicine at UW and is the vice president of the UW House Staff Association, the union for residents at the University of Washington.
Hello, thank you. Yes, my name is Zoe Sandsted, and I'm a family medicine resident physician at University of Washington and the vice president of the UW House Staff Association, or UWHA, which is our labor union for the residents and fellows at UW. I live in the 6th district and we work all over Seattle, including at UW, but I'm mostly a primary care doctor in Northgate. I'm joining this call today in solidarity with my colleagues at UW Medicine who live paycheck to paycheck and who are rent burdened, and my patients who deserve better. As healthcare workers, residents are on the front lines of the fight against COVID. UWHA members have been taking care of patients in the COVID ICUs, acute care wards, and emergency rooms at Harborview UW Medical Center and the VA hospital. Dozens of our members, including myself, were redeployed to cover extra shifts caring for COVID patients without hazard pay. We have seen firsthand the health and economic impact this pandemic has had on our patients. This crisis has made even more evident the systemic inequities and serious problems with our healthcare system and our unjust society that we already knew existed, but that have never been more important to address. I'm a primary care doctor. I spoke with a patient recently who was discharged from the hospital after recovering from COVID, and the medicines that she needed to continue her recovery at home were going to cost $500. She couldn't pick them up and went without them for days. The COVID ICU I worked in was almost exclusively patients who are immigrants and people of color, showing how this virus does discriminate and how it disproportionately impacts those of us who are already most vulnerable. Even before COVID, nearly half of all Seattle renters struggled to pay rent, including many of our UWHA members themselves. While many of our patients are also struggling, and while they don't know if they will have somewhere to go home to, the biggest companies in our city bring in record profits at the expense of our livelihoods. Big companies tell us that this is a difficult financial time for them. In our current negotiation sessions with our employer, who is technically a nonprofit, actually, they tell us they have no more money to increase our pay to a fair wage during COVID or to provide hazard pay. What they miss is that this is a global economic crisis for all people, for the workers, for the citizens, not for the corporations. The people of Seattle, including our healthcare workers and our patients, need relief, and we need it now. Seattle has the responsibility to acknowledge the institutional injustices it's allowed to perpetuate and do something about them. We must tax these big companies to provide the services that our community needs. Affordable and supportive housing, investments in Green New Deal programs will protect our environment, and emergency COVID aid.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandstead. Next up, we have Wes Stewart, who is a member of DSA Seattle and a social worker who lives in District 7. Wes?
Thank you for having me here and allowing me to share.
Would you like
my name is
I wrote
Wes.
75%
My
of it.
pronouns are he and they. I'm 23 years old and I live in District 7. 5 years ago, I was living in San Francisco as a homeless young adult. My experiences being homeless was formational to the person I am today. As stated, I'm currently working as a social worker at the Mockingbird Society. As a veteran of homelessness, fighting to uplift the voices of homeless youth and young adults and advocate for legislation to end homelessness altogether. Although we do not provide direct service to our homeless neighbors, my work has me engaging with the community, service providers, and officials at the city, county, and state level. I know the tax Amazon legislation is critical for Seattle's unhoused population, as well as the social workers who sacrifice their health and safety to provide for the community. Amazon is a Seattle-based company, and as such, has a responsibility to protect and maintain the well-being of the community like any other Seattleite. For too long, Amazon has extracted labor from our neighbors, purchased and occupied native lands, and manipulated our local government with bottomless buckets of cash. Amazon has contributed to the homelessness crisis by employing thousands of college-educated white and Asian folks, raising the median rent, and displacing Black and Brown communities. Amazon directly escalates the wealth inequality in our area by buying politicians, depleting municipal budgets, and impeding effective crisis intervention by our government. For me, tax Amazon is not about retribution, it's about community solidarity. A small tax on this multi-billion-dollar company could provide monthly checks to low-wage social workers on the front lines of the housing and homelessness crisis. Like healthcare workers, social workers are public servants fighting COVID-19 in our community with limited PPE and no space to social distance. In addition, the tax could be expanded to provide funds for homeless folks to afford food, housing, and lifestyle goods, thus stimulating the local economy and rescuing small businesses. The federal government has responded to COVID by a one-time check of $1,200 to some Americans. Secretary Mnuchin has said this money should sustain folks for 10 weeks. That is a monstrous assertion. For homeless or recently unhoused young people, they will not receive a check because they did not file for taxes last year. They can't get a job because of stay-at-home orders. They can't safely quarantine, nor can they access health service. So the virus will continue to ravage their undernourished and overstressed bodies. As the Trump administration throws pennies at working people, Amazon has accumulated more billions in interest-free loans and stealing from Small Business Fund. Bezos himself has made more than $24 billion in profit since the COVID crisis began. Knowing these facts and allowing young people to continue living in destitution is grossly unjust. COVID-19 has escalated the problems in Seattle. This public health crisis will escalate issues of wealth inequality, racial inequality, and homelessness across the country. It's the responsibility of our institutions to escalate their response. I believe this crisis is an opportunity for Seattle to meet these challenges with bold, anti-oppressive, pro-working class legislation and a progressive tax code. Taxing Amazon is politically and morally correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Up next, we have Anitra Freeman, a formerly homeless activist involved in the Women's Housing Equality and Enhancement League organizing effort. Anitra?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. WHEEL is a grassroots organizing effort of homeless and formerly homeless women. One of our major projects for the last 20 years has been a shelter that welcomes any woman in any condition at any time of night, the only shelter of its kind in Seattle. The COVID crisis has severely impacted our community, the homeless community. We were already in a state of emergency, officially recognized and still not acted on with the resources necessary to the scale of the emergency. So homeless people and everyone working with and serving homeless people were already stretched thin. Now it's an emergency on top of an emergency. When you're homeless, you're afraid all the time, even when you're asleep. And now it's fears on top of that. When you're homeless, you're in need all the time. You never have everything you need. You're always choosing between one need and another. And now you have new needs that are essential to your life and no new money to deal with them. So thank you, Shama, for thinking about that. WHEEL, this small grassroots community of homeless and formerly homeless women, together with SHARE, homeless and formerly homeless men and women, provide for each other a big slice of the emergency shelter in King County. We do it on a shoestring. It's always been a scramble. And now it's a grueling grind. It's nerve-wracking and exhausting. And if we don't get some help soon, it's going to be heartbreaking when we have to tell a woman, we have no space and we can't tell you anybody who has space. Because there is no new shelter, even in this crisis. Shelters, spaces have been opened up to give people distance from each other, but that's not new beds. There was an encampment swept in Ballard on Monday, even though the CDC has advised cities not to do sweeps in this crisis. There was not enough shelter for everyone who stayed there in Ballard. There's no mental health support for the people in shelter or for the staff. There's no treatment support. There's no support, period. Hospitals are still sending people out to the street without shelter arrangements. The other day, police brought a severely distressed woman to our shelter who had been just released from a mental health facility with no housing, no shelter arrangement, with no place to go. And whenever the shelter in place orders are over, the rooms that open for spacing will close. The shelters that have been allowed to go 24 hours will go back to nights only, and there will still be no new beds and no new housing. Planning for afterward needs to start now, and the Share Wheel community needs to be at that table. Let's not go back to normal. Normal was killing people already. Let's meet this emergency with some real effort. This legislation will not end homelessness in Seattle, but it's the best first step I've seen in 25 years. Thank you, Shama, for getting this started. Now let's all get behind it and finish it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anitra. Up next, we have Amanda Sorrell, who is an editor at Mother Earth News magazine and an organizer with 350 Seattle and the Seattle for a Green New Deal campaign. 350 Seattle is a grassroots organization that works toward climate justice and systems change by organizing people to resist fossil fuels, build momentum for healthy alternatives, and foster resilient, just, and welcoming communities. Amanda?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Sorrell, and as Avi said, I'm an organizer with 350 Seattle, and I'm on 350 Seattle's Green New Deal campaign team, and I represent 350 Seattle on the Tax Amazon Coordinating Committee. Thank you for having me, and thanks very much to everyone else who has shared their perspectives tonight. So as many of you know and have even named during this town hall, before the virus hit, we were already in a crisis. We have a homelessness crisis. We have an affordability crisis that displaces people and makes Seattle livable for only a few. And we have a climate crisis, the worst effects of which scientists say will be irreversible in a decade. And now we have fuel on the fire in the form of another emergency, a pandemic. And these emergencies are all connected. We have an opportunity to address them simultaneously by leveraging our region's vast financial resources in the corporate sector. Like Shama said, we know someone is going to have to pay for this, and it clearly should not be working people or communities who are already bearing the brunt of these other problems. I was present for an exciting moment last year when the entire Seattle City Council resolved to make a Green New Deal a reality. This legislation being considered would be the first step toward making good on that promise. It would create thousands of permanently affordable homes, transition tens of thousands of homes off of fossil fuels, and generate thousands of well-paid jobs. I saw today that 16,000 of those jobs would be created in the first 5 years, which really counters the idea that this is somehow a job-killing tax. It would, put simply, make Seattle healthier and more equitable. So I see this as the council's chance to lead and to prove its commitment to that Green New Deal resolution passed last year, and to making sure that the people who are already most affected by all of these interlocking problems are the people who drive the solutions and have access to the relief and to the housing and to the jobs. And because I organize with a climate justice group, I do want to address the fossil fuel piece. One of the Seattle for a Green New Deal values is that the climate crisis is a moral emergency. And that value reads, human-caused global warming is already killing hundreds of thousands of people every single year and is pushing species and ecosystems to extinction. The United States has been the biggest contributor to that pollution, so reducing it is a moral imperative for governments at all scales. And so, of course, that includes Seattle. Seattle's two biggest emission sectors are transportation and buildings powered by natural gas. This tax addresses both of those, because without dense, affordable housing that keeps working people in the city and out of traffic, reducing our transportation emissions will not be possible. So the housing and the fossil fuel transition outlined in this tax are essential for our future. And we can't just patch up one of these problems and hope the rest will take care of themselves. We have to start building resilience now to address what we're facing, and we can't afford to forget about the future in the process. Plus, the climate crisis is here. I named those people who are already being affected, already dying. We have an opportunity here, and I fear if we don't take it, I'm afraid for what our future will look like. Of course, our present is already so tenuous and scary. So I ask the council members who are present or who will receive comments from this town hall, please pass the strongest version of this tax Amazon legislation. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Next, we will hear from some council members. First, we have Councilmember Kshama Sawant, who's going to read Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda's remarks.
I'm sorry, everybody. I don't think I received the remarks from Councilmember Mosqueda. I did ask her this morning and this afternoon, and she said she would. But if I might just paraphrase my understanding very quickly of her remarks so far. As I said before, she has said repeatedly that austerity budgeting is not an option and that we have to address the crisis and that we will need progressive revenues. And I would also remind the community that it was very, very important that in 2018, when some of the council members who are currently serving were also on the council, obviously Council Member Lewis is newly elected, but at that time in 2018, as many of you remember, many of you were part of the struggle then, we had, starting in 2017, we had built a momentum through the Stop the Sweeps struggle and the Housing for All Coalition, Socialist Alternative, many other organizations like Nicholsville 350 were involved at that time. We had enough momentum to win a unanimous vote for a much smaller tax, Amazon tax, basically a tax on big business. That's what we mean by Amazon tax, is a tax on big business. And despite that strength of the movement, unfortunately, we saw Mayor Durkin and the majority of the council end up doing a backroom negotiation with big business lobbyists and repealed the tax at that time. That was, in my view, I've been on the council for 6 years, or just over 6 years. That was perhaps the most shameful moment in city council history, as far as I am aware of. And at that time, it was very important that Councilmember Mosqueda and I both voted against the repeal. And and just to echo, not her, but some community members who've spoken in public testimony in relation to this, where repeatedly community members have thanked both me and Councilmember Mosqueda for doing the right thing then, and then connecting that to elected representatives really needing to do the right thing here. What they have said is that Council members Juarez, Gonzalez, and Herbold, who voted for the repeal, which was really bad that they did that at that time, but they have a historic opportunity to right that wrong. And I've often thought about this and thought, how many of us have made major mistakes in our life, in our personal lives, our professional lives, and never got a chance to correct it? Well, these council members have a unique opportunity that most of us don't get in our lives, which is to correct the same mistake and set the record straight. And I really join all the community members who've said that we want the council members who voted for the repeal in 2018 to do the right thing this time, and for council members who voted against the repeal and have stood for the Amazon tax previously to stand steadfast now as well, because I know a lot of the council members are going to be facing pressures from big business. I don't, because I don't try to finesse between the interests of big business and the interests of working people, because those interests are polar opposite. And I proudly stand unambiguously with working people. And I hope that other council members will do as well. And once I receive the comments from Councilmember Mosqueda in the next day or two, I will make sure to share it with everybody who's on here as a panelist or on the live stream.
Thank you so much, Kshama Sawant. Up next, we have Councilmember Andrew Lewis, who represents District 7, which includes downtown Seattle, Queen Anne, Interbay, and Magnolia. He's also a former member of UAW 4121. Councilmember?
Hey, thank you so much. And actually, just a slight correction to that, I was a member of UAW 2865, I think, which is the Berkeley Bay Area local. But in any event, solidarity, same union. Very proud to be here and to be the guest of UAW as a former dues-paying member of UAW, as well as a former member of AFSCME. So very proud to be a supporter of organized labor and from organized labor, and be a fourth-generation union member. So thanks for organizing this and for having me here. I want to thank all the panelists who really shared, their strong rationale, their passion, and their personal struggles that have informed their positions on this legislation. I want to thank Councilmember Sawant for bringing this discussion forward and for introducing this legislation for our consideration as a council. I'm mostly here tonight for the purposes of this town hall to listen to folks. I appreciate you organizing this opportunity for me to interface with my constituents. I'm always going to go and accept an offer to do that. And I think this was well organized and well curated. And I want to thank Ted and Councilmember Sawant's office for reaching out with the details earlier today. I have to say that one thing that really stuck with me from Councilmember Peterson's editorial the other day that he wrote in the Seattle Times, and there were a lot of points in that editorial that some which I think deserve our merit and consideration in crafting legislation. But one that really stuck with me as something that for me is not acceptable and something that we cannot do is a 10% general fund cut. And I have a lot of respect for Councilmember Peterson. I look forward to working with him as we go into the budget process, but I'm not going to put my vote behind a 10% cut to the general fund, just for perspective on what that would do to the working people of this city and to essential services. A 10% general fund cut is impossible without making significant changes to the fire department, to the police department. It would represent almost 3 times everything that we currently spend on human services and supportive services for people experiencing homelessness. It is an unacceptable proposition and something that cannot be accomplished without significant hardship and harm, not just to the working people of the city, but to everybody who visits, who works, who plays here. A 10% cut to the general fund is just simply not acceptable. To avoid a 10% general fund cut, we know right now, based on the presentations we've heard from the city, that it's going to require some form of new revenue. As has been established, we already have the most regressive tax system in the state, and the state has the most regressive tax system in the country. So we have the dubious distinction of having the most regressive tax system in the entire United States. So my hope is that that new revenue is going to be progressive. So I can say this right now, not in terms of exactly where things are going to fall with this legislation, because I'm not completely decided yet as to all of the individual components of this package. But I will say that in discussing the budget, I am certainly not going to assent to a 10% general fund cut. I'm certainly not going to assent to a primarily regressive form of new revenue to offset those cuts. So I think that this conversation is definitely something that's on the table. I'm here to listen. I'm very respectful of your time, and if my mind was authentically made up on things, I wouldn't be here to listen to what people had to say. So I do appreciate this opportunity to hear from folks, and I'll turn it over to you guys. I actually, I have to jump off about 7:15, unfortunately, but what I will say is, I'm very accessible via email. People know where to find me. Councilmember Sawant knows where to find me. So if if people ask me questions and I'm not able to get to them, or I'm not able to hear your concerns, please feel free to send them an email form. We are assiduously noting and collecting and responding to people's inquiries about everything, including these revenue proposals. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you for your comments, Councilmember Andrew Lewis. Next up, we have UAW 4121 member David Clancy, who is a graduate student in the math department at UW. He's going to be fielding questions that have been submitted to us during the duration of this town hall. David?
Hey, so I'm going to start out with a comment from the handle Tardy Toes. They're a member of District 7, and they're thankful that Andrew Lewis took time to join us tonight. They mentioned that during the campaign, they received 4 separate visits from union workers supporting Councilmember Lewis's campaign. And they have high hopes that he'll continue to support working people during this time. Another one of Councilmember Lewis's constituents, Amelia, urges Councilmember Lewis to vote in favor of this tax. They say these companies receive a number of tax breaks to sustain and grow their businesses. They can in turn afford to invest in the community that provides labor and infrastructure. We are struggling as a city, and it's time to step up. So at this time, I think it would be great if Councilmember Lewis could respond to Amelia's comment. Will you support the Amazon tax, or not just oppose these budget cuts?
Oh, there we go. So Amelia, thank you for your question. I'll just refer back to my comments that I made a few minutes ago, that I am still considering all the information in these proposals. So it's certainly still on the table, but I haven't made a final decision yet. And I do appreciate your putting your thumb on the scale for voting yes. And I'm going to definitely note that and consider that as I'm making a final choice.
Oh. All right. So Fred is commented that we support the proposal that the top 2% of big businesses be taxed to help offset the huge need created by the pandemic. He thanks the council members for advancing this, and then Fred and Marianne, who he wrote on behalf of, live in District 7. Laura from District 7 says, I'm in District 7 and I want to thank Councilmember Lewis for extending eviction protections. I want to know if he believes we can pass right to council support for when the inevitable wave of evictions happens next year after the protections have been lifted. Right? So Councilmember Lewis, would you care to respond to that?
What did she specifically ask? I couldn't quite hear you when you, on like what kind of legislation next year?
We can pass the, whether or not we can expect legislation from City Council protecting people from evictions when the inevitable wave of evictions happens next year after the current protections have been lifted.
Well, I think that that's certainly something we can look into. The current protections that we passed this week will be in place for quite some time. So I think that falls under the passing that bridge when we come to it. I think certainly if we're in a position where there is mass unemployment and mass economic uncertainty, and an intervention like that is warranted to keep people inside, I think it's a fair proposal to consider, certainly.
Okay. Megan Murphy has commented, every single resident here should read and have study groups about how awesome this legislation is. Right. Thank you for that comment, Megan. So a user Scribble Owl says I don't have a specific question, but I'm very interested to know what my District 7 council member, Andrew Lewis, is prepared to do to help his constituents with COVID recovery now now and on an ongoing basis. And they'd also like council member to note that the roommate and themselves both strongly support the Sawant-Morales tax Amazon legislation. So Councilmember Lewis, are you prepared to help your constituents with the COVID recovery now and on an ongoing basis?
Right. Well, I appreciate that question. I've been working with my colleagues to pass any number of measures that are designed to respond to the COVID crisis, ranging from the eviction moratorium that we passed yesterday, actually, with a unanimous vote, to investing millions of dollars in small business subsidies through the Small Business Stabilization Fund that have helped a lot of small and minority-owned businesses stay afloat throughout this crisis and keep people employed. Investing millions more above what the council had already invested in rent relief for people that are in a position that cannot afford to pay their rent. Being a source of information to connect people with state and federal resources that have not been effectively or efficiently delivered and have had a lot of problems in people being able to apply, for example, for unemployment, there's a state small business relief fund. So those have been the things that I've been engaged to up to this point, and I'm certainly willing to thoughtfully consider any proposal that comes forward that can provide further relief. I've been working with our members of Congress to try to inform the next round of federal relief that's going to come through and hopefully get more money directly in the hands of working people instead of going through go-betweens and workarounds that seem to have benefited only the biggest companies and biggest firms rather than directly supporting working people. So those are a couple of the things, and I'm happy to, we've got more proposals every week that are being considered by the council and that are coming down from the mayor. So every week we're doing what we can as a city to provide more relief and more assurance in this time of instability and public health challenges.
Okay, so now I think there's a question for Councilmember Sawant. What's the best way to counter Mayor Durkin's charge that you can't interloan the around $200 million? And that's from Jonathan Witt.
Thank you, David, for conveying those questions from community members. First of all, I would just ask Nick Jones from my office and Ted Verdone to share the link to the FAQ that my office has prepared, the frequently asked questions on the Amazon tax legislation from Councilmember Morales and me. And the question that you just read out about interfund loans is part of that discussion in the FAQ. And just to explain to community members, it's a routine function of any city or in any legislative body to plan the budget of a given year based on projections for revenues in the future year. That's how ordinary people also fill out their taxes. When you pay your taxes, you're paying taxes on your income in the past year. You're not paying taxes in the current year for the income in the current year. And so that kind of time lag is built into budgeting as a normal process. And similarly, the idea of having some funding buffers within the budget that was already passed in the last year, and those buffers to possibly be used for new needs that came up, like this pandemic, for example, cash assistance that didn't exist before, but now it does. We are in the middle of a pandemic that we didn't know was going to happen. And so it is a routine function for the city government to use those existing buffers of public revenues that are not being used by anything. So it's not a question of taking away from existing uses so that we can fulfill the need that has come up and then make sure that we fill that buffer back in a given sort of time. So the city council has to stipulate how much time it is going to take to fill the buffers back in that were used for a given purpose. And so what we are doing in this legislation to provide the immediate $200 million worth of cash assistance for up to 100,000 most vulnerable families, households, is exactly that, using existing funds that are not in use right now to provide that cash assistance immediately, start the Amazon tax, really urge the council to pass unanimously this Amazon tax so that we have tax revenues coming in starting when taxes are going to be liable. And then we use those tax revenues to pay back those interfund loans. So it's a very routine mechanism. It's a routine mechanism to such a degree that virtually every year the city council passes interfund loans. The mayor asks for interfund loans. Mayor's office does that. And under certain conditions, the city council has to go through a vote to approve that. And it's so routine that in my 6 years in city council, I have never once, not once heard any council member raise a stink or any mayor talk about interfund loans as if, not only as if they're controversial, but as if it's not even technically feasible. And my God, it might be illegal. These are the suggestions the mayor has put out into the corporate media. And she's either extremely uninformed of her own work as the mayor, or it's completely dishonest and disingenuous because such a thing is not true. They're a routine mechanism. And you know how routine it is? It's just yesterday in the city council meeting, we approved an interfund loan. Now, granted, it was for a smaller amount. And yes, we don't deny that the $200 million is a much larger amount than is ordinarily done. Usually, the largest amount that we've recently seen from central staff is something like 85 million. But look, we are in an extraordinary period. So it demands extraordinary courage and extraordinary solutions that are commensurate with the scale of the crisis. So I don't accept, first of all, it's untrue. It's an actual falsehood to say that this is not routine or to have any kind of suggestion that this is not legal or it is not technically feasible or it's not routine. All of that is true. But as far as the amount is concerned, I don't accept this political logic that because $200 million of interfund loan hasn't been done in any time in the recent past, we can't do it now. Well, we are in an unprecedented crisis right now. What is the city council going to do? It would be remiss of the city council and the mayor if they did not address this crisis, because as Wes said, this is not about retribution against big business. It's about doing the right thing as a community. However, on the flip side, if the city council does not do this, it is retribution against working people because we will face the brunt of this crisis, whether they admit it or not. That is going to happen. Furthermore, what we have seen is the CARES Act, the federal stimulus that has been passed. It has, offered funds to various city and other governments, local governments. We have a certain amount of resources for emergency funding. It is more than we had anticipated, more than the city council had anticipated. So it is possible to have some of that paid by that stimulus package, the stimulus package dollars, and the rest paid by interfund loan. So it's possible to have a smaller interfund loan and make sure that the rest is paid for by this money that we have received from the federal government. But my point is that all of this is just, these are technical details. There is no problem with any of those solutions or any combination of those solutions. All of that is fine. The main point we need to draw out from this whole discussion is to understand that it is not actually the objections from the mayor or from Councilmember Peterson or anybody else on the council who might raise objections to this. It is not about the interfund loan. It is not about the technical details. It is all of these technical questions are subterfuge because they don't want to actually admit, well, my big business constituents are angry and they don't want me to actually do this, and I don't have the courage to do it. And that's why I'm raising these technical details. Because as I said, as a matter of fact, there is no such problem. And I would really urge everybody to look at the FAQ and, arm yourself with the responses to make sure that we don't buy into this sort of distortion of the facts that is being presented by the mayor.
All right. And I know Councilmember Lewis has to leave soon, but we have one more question for him coming from Alex Fritz. He says, I voted for you in D7 and I support the Tax Amazon initiative. When you say you have concerns about parts of the legislation, to which parts are you referring? Details are appreciated.
There we go. Okay. Right. I mean, I appreciate that question. I think it speaks more to details than the philosophy behind the legislation. I mean, I'll say that, like, I fundamentally agree with the principle that taxation should be progressive, that it should that there should be high marginal rates, that people that are in a position to pay more because they've done quite well should pay more. But I think that in terms of and you know, we don't have to get into it now with all the details, and I've appreciated Councilmember Sawant's argument and counter argument in the media narrative, because all of these things are being aired. But you know, I do have some concerns over the scope and scale of the interfund loans, which Councilmember Sawant just talked about. I do agree with her that interfund loans are a routine thing that the city council does, and that we did indeed just do an $8 million interfund loan, or approved one yesterday. I think the scope and scale of the interfund loan that we are currently considering under the legislation is considerably larger than any other interfund loans in recent history. There are certain consequences for failing to pay back an interfund loan, because we're essentially borrowing against ourselves. My understanding of some of the conversation about the some of the legal issues around the interfund loans has to do with the accounts that we are proposing to borrow from, which are voter approved levies. So it's something I certainly want to look into. And, you know, again, I just want to put out there, I think that the arguments that Councilmember Sawant has put into the media and in this town hall today are all perfectly compelling answers to some of these questions. And some of it comes down to our willingness and desire as a council to assume certain levels of risk. You know, to an extent, we're not going to know until we're kind of halfway through it whether it was a less risky or more risky decision. So, you know, it's really about just working through those details. And I look forward to working with my colleagues, including Councilmember Sawant, to work through those. We've had very informative hearings that have been very fair and had a very comprehensive airing of the details in this legislation. We have a capable central staff that can work to capably and effectively make amendments and changes to get at things that are more around technicality or administrability if something should come to that. So, you know, those are some of the concerns initially. I have to go now, unfortunately, so I'm going to leave you hanging with that. But you know, again, if I didn't get to your questions or if I didn't get to any particular comments that you wanted to make, you know, send me an email. We are super assiduously tracking constituent communications on this issue, and I do want to hear from you, and I want to hear your position on this legislation, and you know, your personal stories are really informative and instructive. So I do appreciate your time, and thanks for having me here. And please keep me posted on what you could use as a constituent in District 7.
Right. Thanks, Council Member Lewis, for being able to attend. So briefly, Councilmember Sawant, could you respond to some of the problems that Councilmember Lewis brought up?
Yeah, I think, you know, just in response to the concerns that Councilmember Lewis and I know other council members like Gonzalez have expressed, obviously we are all in agreement that we don't want to pass any sort of reckless legislation, but I do feel it is unfortunate that council members are suggesting that there might be something problematic or reckless. As I said, it's a routine legislation. It is about using funds that are not in use currently and then having a very clear, mathematically designed and very responsible path back to address those, you know, refill the borrowing, as I said, from the interfund loans. So I do find it troubling that there are suggestions that there might be problems, even if they're not saying that there might be problems, because I think we need to frame this in the context of the social situation. Councilmember Lewis also, tonight he talked about the consequences to borrowing. Of course, I'm, as an economist, I could not agree more that we have to have a responsible approach in the city council. In the committee, I think last time he said, I would be concerned about a time bomb in relation to the interfund loan borrowing. I will say, though, that this needs to be put in the perspective of the social situation that our working class families and our entire community, as Amanda said, is facing. And that is the time bomb of the price that this deep recession is going to extract from the most vulnerable people in our society and the vast majority of the working class. But first, it will hit the most vulnerable, the working class communities of color, our immigrant neighbors, who are also while they're afraid of their financial time bomb, also are constantly having to fear deportation. And so I think that if there is any time bomb, any responsible elected representative should be concerned about, it is what's going to happen to the vast majority of working people and our society if we don't have a responsible approach from elected representatives. And I will tell you, history will judge elected representatives very harshly if we don't act in this crisis, because not addressing the crisis, not having the courage to pass a tax on big business and taking up routine technical mechanisms to make sure that that happens immediately, that will be reckless and that will lead to a time bomb. And so I think we have to make sure that we place the right context here. And I would also say to all council members, look, we are not playing games here. And I have never done that. My office has never done that in the six years that we've been in office. We are very open about where we stand. We have a fully fledged legislation. If you don't like this or that aspect of the legislation, bring your alternative, where I'm happy to consider. And if you have a better technical approach to it, I would happily sign on to it. This is not a question of intellectual property. It is a question of doing what is needed at this moment. And as others have said, doing what's morally imperative at this moment. And I'll tell you, as far as risk is concerned, assuming risk, well, where is the risk right now? The risk is all on the shoulders of working families. I've literally heard Uber drivers say that they are in such financial dire straits that they are having to consider, they're calling family meetings to decide which meal to forego in the day. Should we forego breakfast or lunch or dinner? That's how bad things are. This is not hyperbole. This is actual reality. And that's where the risk is. And I think we have to address it immediately.
All right. I think that's it for questions. So I'd like to thank our panelists, along with council members Lewis, Sawant, and Mosquedo, for contributing their remarks to tonight's discussions. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending this event and for submitting great questions for our panelists and council members. This was a productive discussion. All of you can take action now to help win the Amazon tax to fund emergency COVID relief, jobs, housing, and the Green New Deal. Here are some specific things you can do. Information about these things will show up on your screen shortly. First, I want to encourage everyone to email our council members about the Amazon tax. In particular, I encourage you to write to our council members in District 4 and 7 and let them know that you are counting on them to support the Amazon tax. On screen, you should see the email addresses you need to do these two things. And please attend the Budget Committee meeting next Wednesday. That's the 13th. There will be a watch party starting at 9 a.m. and the council meeting will start at 10 a.m. If you want to sign up for public comment, you can do that starting at 8 a.m. Information about this should be on screen now. And now I'm going to turn this over to Councilmember Sawant to close the event.
Thank you so much, David. And I'll echo what you said about thanking community members for their excellent questions. I think that was really very important for the council to hear. And as you all have said, we will be sharing this recording from the community to all the council members so that they can watch it offline. In addition to the important watch party and budget committee that David just mentioned, I will share another important and exciting event that is coming up that many organizations in our community have already agreed to help organize. I'm sure many of you were with us on May Day, May 1st, International Workers' Day, where we pulled off a really successful, socially distanced, responsible, face covering, wearing protest action, car and bicycle caravan. When we went to the Spheres, and then we went to the majority of our caravan was also at the Cornell and Associates property manager headquarters in East Lake, whose tenants have been organizing around the city to stand with the tenants in their demands. And that, building on the success of that action, we are organizing a car caravan protest on Monday, May 11th, starting at 6:30. We're starting late because we also want workers to be able to join us, those who don't have, those who are not on swing shifts, to be able to join us. So Monday, May 11th at 6:30, make sure you join us. I hope my staff are putting up the information on the screen as we speak. And what we'll do is we'll start at the Swedish Hospital, Cherry Hill campus, right here in District 3. And we'll start gathering there at 6:30. And what we'll do is at 7, we will join our entire community in the city in banging pots and pans to thank our healthcare workers and essential and frontline workers. So we'll do that at 7. And then we're going to drive to Medina to Jeff Bezos's house and a very posh community in Medina, so that we can have our voices heard in the neighborhoods of the billionaire class. But our message, of course, is primarily to elected representatives on the city council and to the mayor's office. Pass this Amazon tax now. Don't water it down. This is a triple emergency, and austerity budgets are not an option. It's either austerity or it's Amazon tax. You take your pick. And I don't know how many of you saw, but Jeff Bezos is on track now, apparently, to become the first trillionaire in human history by 2026, if things go the way they are going. If we don't win any measure of justice, he's going to be the world's first trillionaire. But for those of us who continually face questions from corporate media and from naysayers that, well, this is not just Amazon, what about the other corporations? Well, as I said, it's only 800 corporations, just the top 2% of corporations that will be paying. So don't let anybody tell you it's a tax on small business. But I just wanted to very quickly in closing say that Amazon is obviously the largest corporation that will pay a big share of this tax, but also other corporations that will pay this tax if we are able to win this. And that's why we need to keep escalating the movement. Are Starbucks, Expedia, Weyerhaeuser, Tableau Software, Redfin Corporation, which is a big real estate company that is making a lot of profits and has made in the past, Nordstrom, Real Networks, Marchex. So these are all corporations that are doing extremely well. And yes, they are not as big as Amazon, but they are extremely prosperous and they have a lot of cash reserves, primarily because they've had a decades-long corporate tax haven in our city. Well, it's important to change that. And working people have next to nothing. Many of us don't even have the paycheck, which was the only thing we ever had because many of us are laid off. So let's gather on Monday, May 11th at 6:30, start at Swedish Cherry Hill Hospital. And then on May 13th, as David said, join us for the watch party and the committee. Oh, I forgot one thing. If Nick can show the posters we've made 2 posters, one on austerity and how austerity needs to be rejected by the council and we need the Amazon tax, and then another poster on how this is an emergency. We want to dot the entire city and at least key neighborhoods with these posters, but we need your help. You need to be part of this movement, and watching this town hall is extremely important, but that won't be enough. If you haven't gotten involved, we need you to get involved. We need your friends and family and coworkers to be involved. And we need to build this movement safely in a physically distanced manner. So if you can help us put up these posters in your neighborhood or in other neighborhoods, if you're able to drive and go into other districts and do it, then can you just indicate in the feed, on the live streams, and Nick will make sure to note it down and get in touch with you, and we'll organize the postering. You don't have to spend any money. We will provide you with posters. We believe that's a good use of taxpayer resources to fund the rights of taxpayers themselves. So just let us know if you have a time, even an hour or 2 hour time blocks. If you have once or twice or thrice a week, that makes a huge difference. So join us in doing this simple but important effort of getting the word out by getting posters up all over the city.